In this presentation, I want to share some of the rationale and thinking behind the work that we will do under the banner of the 2030 project. I will look at the context for the project, outline the need for ongoing review and innovation, look at the type of innovation that is likely, and suggest the approach we should take based on the growth mindset approach. The 2030 project will consider how the college, in working towards its strategic purpose of inspiring excellence in teaching, learning, service and faith, can provide the quality education that our students will require in order to prepare them as effectively as possible for their futures. Some of the major factors which form the context to the work of the 2030 project include the increasing effects of technology and, more specifically, automation, the dynamic and unknown features of the future workplace, the nature of employment and the skills that students are likely to need. In the rapidly changing and ever more technology-driven world, the aspects that the project will need to consider will include matters of well-being, personal resilience, spirituality, physical health, in addition to the skill sets required by the wide range of employment activities that our students will need. We are obviously talking about innovation and change. Whenever significant change is talked about, there is a wide range of attitudes and responses. We can consider this as a continuum of skepticism for all those involved. This continuum ranges from where a given person has a high level of acceptance to where a person holds a position of rejecting the proposed ideas. For example, when considering the likely effect of automation on the workforce, Steve Denning, who writes for the Forbes website and magazine, is very skeptical. Some commentators, including technologists and economists, put forward that the effects of automation and technology are likely to bring about the need to protect people from the effects of massive change in the way we work and earn money. Denning believes these ideas to be an overreaction and the proposed situation very unlikely. His skepticism is balanced by those at the other end of the scale, such as Martin Ford. Ford wrote the book Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future, which details the highly significant likely effect of automation on production, education, employment, medicine, artificial intelligence, and a range of other aspects of our world, including the possible need for a universal guaranteed income to prop up consumption in order to make production and economic growth a sustainable activity. When looking at these types of far-reaching issues and their effects on education, members of the college community are likely to be spread across the continuum and rest at almost every point from rejection to acceptance of all or any of the proposed ideas, consequences and actions. Consider this statement. In order to do the best for our current and future students, there is an undeniable need for us to innovate the way we educate. This requires significant research and planning and potentially disruptive changes to the way we carry out our work as an independent Anglican school. Where do you currently fall on the continuum of skepticism? Do you reject or do you accept, or somewhere in between when looking at the statement above? As you would expect, we will face the questions and challenges that the 2030 project will present by referring to our core values, including ILR, and the tools that we put in place as a Christian educational organisation. We already have the habits of mind and the habits of heart to use as a set of tools to help us. As an example, the following will be overtly or tacitly used. Thinking flexibly, questioning and problem posing, gathering data through all senses, creating, imagining and innovating, taking responsible risks, thinking interdependently, and remaining open to continuous learning. Obviously others will be included in this list. The habits of heart also assist us by giving a great deal of information around the why question. Why are we doing this? Why innovate and why improve? I would encourage you to read the habits of heart descriptors. They give firm guidance in a range of ways. The 2030 project is a significant effort and will require an informed and open-minded approach. What we don't want to do is end up inspiring this sort of cartoon. We know there are three general types of innovation. The first is sustaining innovation. This is the sort of thing that we do every day whenever we're doing reviews of our curriculum units. Breakthrough innovation takes some of the practices that we already do and innovates them in a significant way, but still based on the existing practice. Disruptive innovation occurs whenever we come up with new processes and new ways of doing things that break the mold. Here are some examples of some of the innovations that we look at. You'll notice that the good to great innovation, which occurred in 2008 and beyond, looked at the existing practices of the college. This then sets this type of innovation at the breakthrough innovation stage. STEM, HASS, open learning spaces and problem-based learning are placed nearer to the disruptive innovation end, although some schools use these sorts of innovations in ways to inform existing practices and so could be placed at the breakthrough innovation section of the diagram. In facing innovation, especially innovation that's likely to feel uncomfortable due to its likely scale or scope, we should have a shared understanding of what it may feel like and what will be expected from members of our community to feel challenged or uncomfortable as familiar processes and structures are necessarily changed. This video clip gives us a way of thinking about how to approach change. The presenter uses the metaphor of riding a 6-foot unicycle when considering innovation.
When I first tried one of these, I learned a lot about balance extremely quickly. First of all, I tried it like this. I thought I'd be closer to the ground just to be careful. But what I realized is if you focus on the ground, that's where you go immediately. The only way to feel a sense of control in an off-balance environment in which you live is to elevate your focus, to elevate your vision, to be able to look farther than others are willing to go. And then you tell me, what's my first move to go forward? What's the first thing I have to do? What was it? Lean forward, right? Off balance, on purpose. What you do on a 6-foot unicycle is you lean forward, you start falling toward your face, and then you chase your body with the unicycle, so hopefully you don't get to your face. It's scary, all right? It makes you a little uncomfortable. But here's the deal. If you limit yourself to what's comfortable, you deny yourself what's possible. If you're unwilling to lean into the uncertainty, if you're apprehensive about change and growth, you may start going backward. Or maybe I'll just stay where I am because I'm already successful, I'm already good. I don't want to get too good too quickly. They couldn't handle me out there. This is called idling, right? Because you're not standing still. You're going forward and backward to protect yourself. We want to lean forward into those changes, accept those new risks and responsibilities. Come on out here, Eddie.
The 2030 project will consider a wide range of issues from both the educational and wider perspectives. This diagram gives one representation of the likelihood of jobs related to subjects studied being impacted by automation. These figures are guesstimates, and a range of graphics of this type can be easily found from a range of sources. However, the most important factor to come out of this type of representation is that there is concern and uncertainty. Our students will be passing from us into their future where this type of concern will exist over the next decades. As responsible educators, we must give attention to how well we prepare our students to thrive in rapidly changing times. The following video clip is the first part of a presentation by the writer mentioned before, Martin Ford. Here Ford presents a summary of some of the trends and concerns for the future. The clip lasts for just over 10 minutes.
It's really become my view that we could well be on the leading edge of just a massive disruption that I think is going to put just a terrific amount of stress on society and also on the economy. And the central idea here, of course, is that smart machines and algorithms and robots are increasingly going to substitute for workers, and they're going to take over more and more of the work that is now being done by human beings. Now, I've been thinking about this for 5 or 6 years, and during that time I've had a chance to talk to a lot of technical people that are deeply engaged in these technologies, people doing research in areas like artificial intelligence or robotics. And I found that a very large percentage of those people generally share my concern that we're headed for this disruption. So there is something of an emerging consensus, you might call it, on the technical side, that we're headed for something that's entirely different. On the other hand, there is also a lot of skepticism out there. And I think that as a group, it's probably fair to say that economists tend to be fairly skeptical of this. The skepticism is sort of anchored in history. It turns out that this idea that machines would displace workers is definitely not new. It goes back at a minimum 200 years to the Luddite revolts. This fear, this concern has been raised again and again, but it's always turned out to be a false concern. So I think that there's quite a bit in common with that old story of the little boy who cries wolf. The alarm is raised again and again. It doesn't happen. People become complacent, but it's important to remember that in the end of that story, the wolf does show up, and I think that could be where we're headed this time. Again, I believe that this time is different, so let me begin by just reviewing what I think is different this time. What's different about today's technology versus the things we've seen in the past? And I point to 3 things that I really think set today's information technology apart. The first thing, of course, is that we've got this exponential acceleration going on, and most people have heard of Moore's Law, I think, which basically says that computing power has been doubling every 2 years or so. But it's actually much broader than that. It extends to software in many cases. It extends to communications bandwidth and so forth. So we're seeing this very broad-based acceleration, and that acceleration has been going on for a long time. It's been going on, in fact, for decades. And when you keep doubling something again and again for decades, I mean, you end up with really an extraordinary amount of absolute progress. Things are moving at a very fast rate, and that's the reason that things, I think, are going to unfold at a rate that is really quite surprising as we go forward. The second thing I would point to is that machines are now taking on cognitive capability. Machines, in a limited sense, are beginning to think. And this means that they're really starting to encroach on the fundamental quality that really sets us apart as a species, the thing that sort of defines people and that so far has allowed us to keep ahead of the march of technology. It's our ability to adapt, to learn, and to think. And machines are in a limited capacity moving into that area now. You know, you've now got smart algorithms that can make decisions, that can solve problems, and most importantly, that can learn. You know, the central technology here is probably machine learning, and that's all about algorithms that can churn through data, and based on that, they can learn and they can make predictions. And that sort of implies that an extraordinary number of jobs are ultimately going to be threatened by this. One way to sort of think about it is to ask yourself, could a particular job be done by another smart person if that person had access to a detailed record of everything that's been done in the past? If the answer to that is yes, then it's a good bet that eventually a smart algorithm or a machine will come along and also be able to follow that same technique. So that, when you really sit down and think of it, that gives you an idea that there's really a very large number of jobs out there that could be impacted by this. And the third thing that's really different is that information technology is a general purpose technology. It's now ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It invades every sector of the economy, every business, every organization. There isn't any safe haven for workers out there. And that's quite different from what we've seen in the past where, for example, farm machinery transformed agriculture. And that did create a lot of unemployment, but it was only one sector of the economy. And those other sectors absorbed the workers that lost their jobs on farms. But now we're seeing a technology that really is going to hit across the board. And so that's what's different. Now, when you put these 3 things together, I think what you end up is really something that looks like a utility almost. It's almost like electricity, but instead of just delivering electric power, it actually delivers machine intelligence. So you've got this broad-based utility that's just going to scale across the whole economy, and one implication of that is going to make everything less labor intensive. There's going to be less need for human labor, especially the kind of labor that is done by what we might think of as average people with average capability and average educations and skill levels. So going forward, I think that that could be quite disruptive. Another very important point that people who are a little bit skeptical about this will make is that there is this ongoing process of creative destruction. And what that means is that old things get destroyed and new things get created. So we know that technology may upend many of the industries that we have today, but we also know that new industries will certainly be created in the future, and of course those industries will have to hire people. So a skeptic might say, doesn't that imply that lots of new opportunities are going to be created in the future? And we can think of what some of those new industries will be, things like nanotechnology and virtual reality and synthetic biology and so forth. And those definitely will exist, but what I'm showing here on this slide is that there are good reasons to believe that those new industries, although they will come into being, are simply not going to hire many people. They won't have much need for human labor, and the reason is that they will utilize all of this powerful technology right from their inception. So what you see here is a comparison of General Motors, which in 1979 had jobs for about 840,000 people, and that compares with Google in 2012 that had less than 5% of that number. And yet, Google actually generated, in inflation-adjusted terms, 20% more in terms of earnings. So Google is actually a more profitable company than General Motors ever was. So this is just an example of the kind of leverage that companies are now able to get from this technology. And the point here is that as we go forward over the next couple of decades, I think that the entire economy is going to come to look more like Google and less like General Motors. And that implies fewer opportunities for human workers. What I'm showing here is the same kind of idea from a different perspective. This is also about creative destruction, but here I'm talking about occupations. Very often you'll hear people say that, 50 or 100 years ago, people would have never been able to imagine all these new jobs that we have today. And that's absolutely true. Things like website designers and social media marketers and data scientists and so forth are all occupations that people even a couple of decades ago would have never foreseen. However, what I'm showing here is that those new jobs, while they exist, they're really a tiny percentage of our employment. It turns out that in the United States, about 90% of workers are in occupations that existed 100 years ago. It's traditional things like driving vehicles, working in offices, doing relatively routine clerical things, factories, and so forth. These are all traditional occupations, and I think it's easy to foresee that over the next couple of decades, a lot of those occupations are going to be disrupted by this. A lot of them are going to be threatened by automation, and there certainly will be new roles that will appear, but it's kind of difficult to believe that there are going to be enough of those new opportunities to really absorb all the impacted workers in more traditional areas. And there's also likely to be a skill mismatch. A lot of the new things being created really require a high level of education or a skill or capability in a particular technical area and so forth. So it will probably be very difficult for many average people to move into those roles, even if there are sufficient openings. So I think that, again, this really points to a coming disruption that we need to start thinking about. So let me just show you a couple graphs from the United States that I think provide some evidence of what's happening here. What you see here is a comparison of hourly compensation for average workers in the United States versus productivity. And productivity is essentially the value of what we produce divided by the number of hours it takes to produce it. And if you pick up any economics textbook, it will tell you that things are supposed to work the way the first half of this graph works, where you see these two lines tightly correlated. What you see there is that productivity increases because of technological progress, and then wages also increase in lockstep with that. The idea is that machines are tools, the tools become better, workers then are able to produce more, and they become more valuable. And as a result of that, they ought to be able to command a higher income. And that's exactly what happened in the United States from the end of World War II up until the mid-1970s. But then something interesting happened, and you see that these two lines basically decouple. Wages are now flat. We haven't seen any growth at all in incomes, but productivity continued its climb. So we've got this opening gap between these two lines. And essentially what they're saying is that now all the fruits of innovation, of all this progress, are being captured by the people that own businesses, basically, business owners and investors and executives, people like that, and average workers are really not getting any of it. And I think that part of the reason that this is happening is that we're seeing the nature of machines change. During this period when these lines were moving together in lockstep, machines were essentially tools. Machines were things that made workers more valuable. But we are now going through a transition where machines are going from being tools to actually becoming workers. They're becoming autonomous and actually in many cases replacing that worker. And so instead of making a worker more valuable, they're actually in some cases making that worker less valuable. And that, I think, is one of the important things that's driving this gap that we see opening up here.
So what do you think? What's your reaction? What do you think the implications are? How will these types of factors impact our kids, prep and onwards? Have a think about these questions, then watch the final 7 minutes of Ford's presentation.
This shows what job creation looks like in the United States by decade. If you go back to the 1960s and look at every subsequent decade, you can see that it looks almost like a declining staircase. Each decade, with the exception of the 1990s, produced fewer jobs in percentage terms than the previous decade. So again, this is an indication that there's some kind of a structural shift happening. Something is happening that's basically making the economy less effective at creating jobs. And you can see this last decade, the first decade of this century was just a total disaster for job creation, where there weren't any new jobs at all created. And that's largely because of the financial crisis that we had. But if you look at the last visible bar here, that's showing the percentage job creation just through 2007, about the time that the financial crisis started. And you can see that it already didn't look very good. So in other words, even if the financial crisis hadn't occurred, this pattern would have held. We still would have had a relatively weak job creation. So again, I think this is an indication that some kind of a fundamental shift is happening in our economy. Another important point, which is really important for people to understand, is that the conventional view we have about the kinds of jobs that are impacted by automation is really not quite correct. The traditional view has always been that technology and automation primarily impact low-skilled work. It's going to come after blue-collar workers, people that don't have a lot of education, people doing, manipulative type work, people standing on an assembly line in factories or working in a warehouse, things like that. As a result of that, the solution that's always been proposed is education. Education is really the only conventional solution we have to this kind of impact. The idea is that when workers lose their low-skilled jobs, we send them back to school, we send them for some more training. They are then able to climb the skills ladder and take on a more, sophisticated role. So perhaps the worker that loses their job in a warehouse may find a new job in an office where they're using their brain more, where they have a higher skill level, they have a better work environment, and then generally they should be better off. What this shows is that the problem with that is that technology is now also climbing that skills ladder. And we're seeing a big impact on white-collar jobs, including many of the kinds of jobs that university graduates take. This slide shows an article from the Wall Street Journal recently, and it's talking about the corporate finance departments in large corporations. And it turns out that the number of people in those departments in big corporations relative to the revenue of those companies has collapsed by about 40% in the last decade. So almost half of those jobs have evaporated, and it's all happened because of smart software that's increasingly taking on those roles. And we see this in many other areas as well. In journalism, there are now algorithms that can generate news stories automatically. Legal document review is being automated. Some areas of medicine, like radiology, are very susceptible to this. So the point is that increasingly we're seeing an impact on the kinds of skilled jobs that university graduates take. And that really has implications for the future, especially in terms of that traditional solution to all of this. A second important thing is that all of this ultimately is going to have an economic impact. It's not just about the impact on individuals and on families and on society. Of course, that's critically important, but there also is an economic impact from this because we need to have consumers. We need to have people who are capable of buying the products and services that are created by the economy. Without that, we run the risk of getting into stagnation or even a kind of downward spiral where there simply aren't enough viable customers out there for businesses to sell to. And if that turns out to be the case, then you really get into kind of a deflationary scenario. And I think you see some evidence of that already. But you can think of this in terms of the drive to inequality that we already see. Think in terms of a billionaire, someone like Bill Gates. In theory, he's got an infinite amount of purchasing power. He can go out and buy anything. But the reality, he's not going to do that. He's not going to buy 1,000 cars. He's not going to buy 1,000 smartphones. He's definitely not going to sit down and eat 1,000 restaurant meals. So when you take purchasing power from 1,000 average people and concentrate that all into the hands of one very wealthy person, you take a lot of demand out of the economy. There are fewer viable customers out there. And that really runs the risk of getting into that kind of a deflationary scenario. This shows some evidence that this is perhaps already becoming an issue. This is a graph of retail sales in the United States versus corporate profits since the recovery from the Great Recession. And you can see that corporate profits have been doing terrifically. We've had unprecedented levels of corporate profitability. But those profits are largely driven by efficiency improvement. They're coming because corporations are cutting costs, in many cases because they're eliminating workers. For the most part, the extraordinary profits are not coming because those businesses are selling more stuff. And yet, looking forward, that approach is unsustainable. You can't forever have corporations becoming more and more profitable just by cutting costs. There's obviously a limit to that. Eventually, they've got to be able to sell more, and in order to sell more, there have got to be viable consumers out there, and those people have to have an income from somewhere. So you can see how that's potentially going to lead to a real problem in the future. So finally, the question then becomes, what can we do all about this? And I think fundamentally we're going to face a decision, a choice. And it's easy to imagine a very utopian outcome. You can imagine a future where no one has to do a dangerous job. No one has to do a job that they hate or an extraordinarily difficult job. We can imagine a future where machines and algorithms and smart systems take on all that work, and that people have more time for their families, for leisure, for engaging in things that they find genuinely rewarding. But it's pretty clear that we're not going to have that kind of utopian outcome unless we solve the income distribution issue. People are not going to have a great future if they don't have an income. Obviously, they need an income to survive. And as I just pointed out, they also need an income so that they can act as consumers and continue to drive prosperity. So I think in the long run, we probably are going to have to look at a genuinely radical scenario, something that decouples income from traditional jobs. And I think that the best way to do that is some kind of a guaranteed basic income, so that everyone in our society will have access to some sort of a livable income, even if they are not able to find a traditional job. And that's something that is politically almost unthinkable right now, but I think that nonetheless, as this trend unfolds, it's probably inevitable that we're going to have to move in that direction. So again, my point in talking about this is really to initiate a conversation. My hope is that people will think about this and talk about it, and as that conversation progresses, hopefully we'll have some realistic solutions that will emerge from this.
What does this mean for us? We have a great deal of thinking, research and planning to do, but overall, what does the 2030 project mean for us? We know that we can't change things outside our circle of influence. But what can we innovate? What should we innovate? What is our value add? What are the implications of the known and likely patterns of change, especially given our strategic purpose to inspire excellence in teaching, learning, service and faith? While we cannot control all of the variables that exist and will exist, it is clear that we will need to stay relevant to our students, both while we have them within our classes and also when considering their likely futures. The 2030 project gives us a way to think about the future by having us consider the children who, while they are currently in the early learning years of education, will be with us and being prepared for their futures until they graduate in 2030. This presentation is intended as a discussion starter. We hope you can be an active participant as we work hard to inspire excellence in teaching, learning, service and faith at Coomera Anglican College.